So making sure that you can communicate regular successes and having things in your suite of projects that are quick wins.
Technology is something where you invest and then it generates value for the company.
Each different type of monetization will have a different way of measuring it. Each different organization will have a different way of measuring it. But the key thing in most of them is having the business processes defined.
I've IPO'd, but I'm very concerned with growth. Like that's one of my primary focuses is growth, customer acquisition, like becoming bigger so that I can make more profits in the future.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Delivery Layer podcast. I am Solomon Khan, the founder of Delivery Layer, and I'm excited to have you here where we talk about data that drives revenue. Many people talk about how data should drive business value, but what does that actually mean? In this episode, I talk with Chris Tabb and Matt Housley, who explain it in detail. All right, everybody, welcome to the Delivery Layer podcast. Matt, Chris, excited to have you here. Thanks so much for coming.
It's really great to be here. Sorry, Chris, go ahead. I talked over you.
Yeah. No, it's good to be here. This is how excited we are. We're talking over each other already.
That's great. Well, especially, I know both of you have, well, Matt, you have a long-standing podcast, and Chris, I know you've got a new one. So hopefully this will be exciting to have you on the other side. And I know we want to talk today about sort of business impact and data monetization and how companies really are driving value with their data. And I know you two are writing a book on this topic. So maybe talk through a little bit sort of how you came to this topic, why you think this is such an important time to talk about this, and sort of just what it is.
I think, well, one reason Matt became a bit available because he'd finished his engineering book, and I think we've been talking a lot about business value comes up so many times, or business performance comes up so many times, and so many conversations we've been trying to articulate what it is, and so I think over the time we've been refining our thoughts and how we can actually allow companies to provide a roadmap, a playbook, to actually achieve that. Because I don't think it's one size fits all. It's like a river; it's going to carve its own path. But understanding, how to navigate that journey and provide incremental value, and what that value is what we're trying to do. And there's no better time at the moment with everyone focusing on their bottom line in some cases, or their future in other cases. Is the generative AI's creating a big opportunity or a big scare for many companies.
Yeah. And absolutely, like Chris said, I finished another book on the fundamentals of data engineering with Joe Reese. And in that book as well, we're very interested in questions of like why we even care about data projects and how data helps the business. We tried to write a book that was a hybrid of like business thinking and engineering thinking. But then several other events the last couple of years have kind of triggered this interest as well. So first of all, you had the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think you went through the same thing with your employer, Solomon, which is at first it was just like knee-jerk cuts. It was this huge financial crisis for businesses. And so they ended up cutting their data teams dramatically in many cases. And then right after that, they realized that they really needed that data. And so then they started trying to bring people back on or hire new people even or scale up their data teams. And that made me think a lot about how we fund data projects. And I've kind of seen three main models for funding data projects. So first is the platform model. And the platform model says, hey, we're a big company, therefore we need a data warehouse, or maybe we need a real-time data bus. And there's this vague notion that those things are important to have a functioning business, but it's not directly tied to business value, right? It's like, okay, we just need this thing because all businesses have this thing and it's expensive at whatever, we're going to pay the price. And then what happens is when you hit a crisis, people start looking in that direction and say, hey, this part of the company is costing us millions of dollars. What are we doing here? Let's just slash it. Another funding model that's been very popular with the waves of new technology we've seen, including like Hadoop, big data, cloud, modern data stack, each new generation of technology. I'll call it the GWiz funding model. And that is, hey, here's this cool new thing. We need this cool new thing because everyone else is doing it. And clearly, hey, if Google is doing this, if we want to be like Google, we need big data. And then, or we need real-time data or whatever it happens to be. But again, there's often not a clear notion of what the value is. Like, what are we trying to accomplish for our business? We know what Google does with this technology. They're this huge, like, search engine, data-oriented company. But what are we trying to do with it? Yeah. And again, those initiatives tend to get cut when they start to get expensive and when budgets get a bit tight. And then the third model, the one that we're pushing for, is a value-driven model. And that is, what is this data doing for our company? In fact, let's come up with some specific goals. And those goals, identifying how it's helping the business, will then help us to fund both the platform and new technology initiatives to say, hey, we have a data warehouse. It does X, Y, and Z for our business. This is how it helps us. This is how it helps our customers. This is how it helps the bottom line. Let's add this new technology, say real-time data for this specific project. And then long-term, those initiatives can continue to grow. And ideally, even when budget cuts come along, they're a bit more protected because you can actually identify how they're helping the business and say, look, we may need to make some cuts, but if we cut all of this is how it's going to hurt our bottom line because this is what it's doing for our business very specifically. And so I think that's kind of what motivated both Chris and I watching these, as kind of coming from this consulting world and watching these waves happen, frankly, a couple of times, not just once.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
So I think the whole modern data stack sort of was another example of everything being driven by the technology. And, I've been a defender of the modern data stack because people kept calling it the post-modern data stack, which I didn't really like. But I think the latest thing we're calling it is the business value data stack. And if you start with a business value, you look at what data stacks needed to support that. To Matt's point, how you can create and generate incremental value that can actually fund future initiatives. And we have this whole concept where we're talking about evidence. And one of the strap lines we're working on at the moment is, business value needs to be evidenceable. We're still working on what the other aspect is. Is it an aspect just on the bottom line, or is it a effect on your share value? Those two things could be different, have different metrics, monitor them. But the key thing is evidenceable. And we've got this sort of concept of, thinking of the legal system. When you put a case together, a business case, think of it as a legal case. You're going in front of a judge and you're going to go and ask for this money or this decision, which will end up in you getting some funding. And to get that decision, your business case needs to have the evidence to support it. And depending on the size of the project you're going for, and also what evidence you've got available, you'll have to build the best case available that will be able to have the right narrative for the right judge that you may have on that case. And we have a thought of the two different scenarios or two different styles of legal system. So you can have a judge that's in a civil case. He is the decision maker. You've got to present your evidence to him, and you'll get your decision from him or her, from the judge. That could be just a CMO, or it could be a CFO if you're just going for a departmental project. But with a forward-thinking vision of, okay, whatever I'm delivering for them, I know that can help with future use cases. And if you do enough of those, what we call civil cases, those small ones where you've got the right, very focused evidence, very focused narrative to win over a couple of these smaller civil cases. Then you've got some reference cases. You can go for a larger case. We've got a number of jurors. Those jurors will be equivalent to a C-suite in your organization, that having the CEO as the judge, that in this case is more arbitrating and then going to give the direction from the result that the jurors provide. But you now need to create many different narratives for different people with different evidence that's going to resonate with them. But if you're able to build enough reference cases from previous successes, you can then much more likely to actually get the verdict you want, which is, here you go, here's the funding for this new strategic initiative that evidence that will provide the value that each of my jurors needs.
Got it. And so this is really interesting because, Matt, what you talked about, splitting up the sort of big platform push versus the gee whiz technology push versus the value driven push? And then Chris, your comments on do you have a judge that's making decisions, or for bigger initiatives, do you go to essentially a jury of the C-suite? You could argue that that is what happened poorly in the past, right? To a certain extent, because none of these big platform plays or the gee whiz technology plays were sold to this. They were in fact sold to the C-suite, and they were sold by business leaders or by data leaders who thought that there was going to be a payoff in the end, maybe that didn't materialize. So what were some of the things that went wrong, or what are some of the things either that on the data side should have been done differently, or on the executive side that should have been done differently, that you think would be driving more value?
So I think the days of easy money have gone, and the evidence that would have been needed for some of the cases that have been won in that previous C-suite is just a nice, pretty PowerPoint presentation and following the hype cycle of, look, everyone else is doing it, we need to do it. So I think that's what we want to try and stop. And we want it to come up with a proper business case where you're using, if we're using that same legal theme as well, you're trying to find the undisputable evidence. You're trying to find the smoking gun. So the example for that we're giving is an onboarding process where you've had all the metadata. Historically, you've seen where people have dropped off at the data onboarding. You've also seen where you've taken people on at the KYC checks that have turned into fraudulent ones. So you now have historical data. Then if you use that as an initiative and say, okay, right, I've got that historical data, I'm going to build a really good watertight case with a little bit of capability and capacity I've got within my team to go and build this would have happened if we put these things in place, and actually provide some good tangible evidence. And the smoking gun is very hard to find, and there's not always going to be ones you can use for that. But with a bit of foresight and thinking of, okay, what sort of metrics I could collect that could become either circumstantial evidence, collection of a number of different data points that are all indicating a positive impact. You use that. Other one is you use a term, a forensic data scientist, a forensic data person who's going to come in and based on their knowledge, experience, put their credibility, say, look, I've looked over this, it's given my seal of approval, I've got my track record, you're going with that credible witness scenario. So I think more of that's needed, and I think that credible witnesses can come with people that have done this before in other organizations, some advisory aspect. It could also come with internally performing as much analysis to provide as much evidence of any ROI. I think the industry's suffered from very large claims for, CMOs are coming in the past and saying, hey, look, I'm going to increase 40 times ROI, and never delivered on it. So going back to getting those quick wins, if you get those quick wins and proving you've delivered on it, you're getting credibility internally. And I think the other concept I'd like to put in there is we've taken too much risk on in the data project portfolio. So if you think of, another concept we're thinking of is a salesperson, if he has two bad months, he's out, he's gone. I think a data team, if you've had, or a data department, if you keep having too many bad news coming out month after month, you're going to lose that funding. So making sure that you can communicate regular successes and having things in your suite of projects that are quick wins that give you the ability to do that forward thing, do that selling of your data projects, to promote what you're doing, or address some technical debt that you're able to do. If people are off your back because they're seeing the successes and you've got a good roadmap, you can use that freedom you've got to go and do things you need to do. So I think it's always thinking about taking on the risk and length of those projects. So I think the days of taking on a 6 to 9 month project before anyone sees anything, you're going to lose the stakeholders. You may have that project going in the background that might be fed by smaller incremental bite-sized projects that have released some value themselves, but have also provided future value in creating foundations for a longer term roadmap which achieves other business value channels. I think that's something that I'll pause a minute because I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But we've got a concept of business value channels, which are linked to MIT's terms of sell, wrap, and improve. If you start thinking what channels you're trying to monetize, it then helps you shape what your foundational technology roadmap is that's going to support that. So then you can pivot as long as you know what you need eventually and what's needed to service those different business value channels and what level of maturity each of them need at a different point. You can start to, as Matt said, fund that runway for you, using those successes to build that road ahead that you haven't traveled down. You've got that, it's suppose the first train that's crossing the country, someone's ahead of you putting down the train tracks ready for your business value train to cross the country. That's a new one, that one. We'll just come up with that.
Nice. It is. This is the first time I've heard it. Solomon, I can give some examples of things that have gone wrong as well, kind of building on what Chris was saying. So actually, I can give some concrete examples. I worked with one company where they had multiple initiatives to do real-time streaming data. So to take all company events and just put them into a streaming bus and make them real-time processable. And in each attempt, there was never a clear use case. In other words, it was never, hey, this is going to improve the customer experience in this particular way, or this is going to improve fraud tracking or inventory or something specific. And so in each case, the initiative would get down the road. It would get very expensive, way more expensive than promised. And then eventually, without value showing up, at some point, cuts would come along and say, hey, this is a very expensive initiative. What are we doing with this thing? And it would get cut. And again, that happened multiple times. So that's an example of what kind of happened on the technology side. In the C-suite, I think part of what's gone wrong is a bit of cultural rot that corporate America and worldwide corporations have inherited from decades ago that hasn't really changed. And that is this idea that IT is a cost center. And that is, you spend money on IT because you have to. It's like the buildings. It's there. You have to pay for it. You don't get anything out of it, but you have to spend money on it. And if you look at your best performing tech companies, places like Apple and Google, for them, technology is a value generator. So yes, it costs money, but just like manufacturing iPhones cost money or manufacturing houses cost money, but then you go sell them. Technology is something where you invest and then it generates value for the company. And I think that's a problem we need to fix. I think we need to bring the C-suite around to this idea that that technology should generate value in your company, which both gives the technology part of the company, the data part of the company more credit, but also imposes more responsibility. And then you need very clear communication channels with those parts of your organization about what's expected and how they can generate value along the lines of what Chris was saying through various business value channels.
That's really interesting. So Speaking of that then and diving in, how do you start to track the monetary value driven by data teams?
So I'll probably start with different types, then after that, how you can measure each of them, because again, there's no silver bullet out there for them. But I think there's approaches you can take in each of the scenarios, some easier than others. So if you go back to MIT's a combination of what they refer to as sell, wrap, improve. So I'll go with the two easy. The sell one's relatively easy to actually calculate. So everyone thinks you're selling raw data. That's probably the least likely thing you're selling. What you're normally selling is curated, aggregated, and derived data that is providing insight, which I know you know a lot about.
Preach. Yes. Delivery layer. Check it out. Yes, all right.
There you go. So, a plug for you there, Solomon. But so if you take, then that one's a very easier one to actually work out the value of that data or creating, because it technically has a SKU, it is a product, you are buying this data, which has this description for this period. So it can very easily line item an invoice, bang, there's the value of that data. And I could go on to a little bit more on that one, which is, I think there's also value in a map to where that data is. That's a new concept I'm thinking of with the world of LLMs. How you train them, it's the competitive advantage is going to be on the quality of how they're trained. So now if so I've got to train my LLMs I want to train it at the least amount of cost on the best amount of data. If I can go to a map that tells me where that is, that's going to be giving me the competitive advantage. So you can make that your own product, Solomon. I'm just having the concept. Oh, we've lost Solomon for a minute.
No, you have?
Anyway.
We don't have your video anymore for some reason.
Yeah, but you're still there. So
that's strange.
okay.
Hopefully it's recording. Yeah.
So that's the easy one to define. I think the next one on the easy to calculate is the improvements. So improvements, it all comes back down to having business processes mapped in the first place, because you can't improve what you can't measure. So if you have a very clear business process defined for each part of your organization, and you have the associated data points of how much time and effort is taking for each of those, it is measurable. Where it gets complicated and where Matt's more of a specialist on this is the customer score of the value of satisfaction part, that becomes harder to perform.
So just to be clear there, what you're talking about is that if you replace your customer support team with ChatGPT and then your customers start to feel very unsupported, how much damage have you done to your business while saving on some support team costs?
Yeah, exactly. So that becomes a hard one. But for example, for an onboarding process, for an internal manufacturing stock process, any optimizations. And I'll give you a good example, like a real life one as well. So you have a supply chain management capability. You've got distribution warehouses, you've got lorries, you've got shops you're going to be delivering things to. Those shops have got planograms. You now need to deliver all the goods to each of the shops in the most efficient way. The most time-consuming resources, or the costly resources, are the people on the shop floor. They're stacking the shelves. So unless you optimize that process end to end, you might save the warehouse driver a bit of time, but he's got a forklift truck. You might save the lorry a bit of time, but saving him 20 minutes time on a journey route, it may not add that much value. But saving the amount of time that the individual has to walk within the shop to go and load them onto the correct shelves. So there's a clear one of, I know how much time it costs in staff bills. If I can optimize that process, it means that it's reduced that amount of time. There you go. There's a saving that hasn't had an impact on my customer satisfaction. And it was worth the development team or the data science team's time to go and analyze it. So those ones, they're easy to find. The next one is probably more harder is the brand and marketing aspect. So, we have an example talking about how do they know that the advert I just saw maybe by Coca-Cola rather than Pepsi?
Sure.
It has no impact on it at all because I hate Pepsi. In fact, every time I go to someone and say, "Is it Pepsi? Do you mind?" I say, "Yes, I do," but I'll take it anyway. It's that has no impact. So how they can perform, how they attribute therein, that's black art or dark art. I don't know how you actually work that black magic. I don't know. It's not something that is easy to. And I think the last one at MIT talk about is the wrap aspect. So wrap is where you're creating a symbiotic capability that is around your main one, which creates that loyalty factor. So you don't want to leave because it's a really nice product. But that just comes down to the customer satisfaction piece. Or maybe you could actually attribute the additional value of selling the it's an extra £1 a month subscription or whatever that additional service is. So each different type of monetization will have a different way of measuring it. Each different organization will have a different way of measuring it. But the key thing in most of them, it's having the business processes defined. Because that's even with the product one, if you've got the business process for how you do your marketing, how you actually get your process your leads back or process your followers or your newsletters, it all needs to be process mapped.
Yeah. So how does that? Because one of the things that was kind of missing from that is the sort of benefit that data teams bring to internal decision making on either at the executive level or at the tactical level from people within an organization. Is that measurable? Is that something that you can say drives business value or doesn't? How does that play into your framework?
So I think what I'll add here is it's hard to measure concretely, right? And as a math person, this kind of drives me a bit crazy, but I also completely understand it. But to Chris's point, this is where the evidencing part comes in. It's like, okay, we can't, it's really hard to attach a dollar value to a good decision, but at least you can point out the good decision that you were able to make based on data. A lot of the decision improvements we have access to, I think, actually come out of the data science world. And that is data science and then statistics before it was called data science came up with these various techniques like clustering and measuring customer churn and measuring customer lifetime value. The problem is that in many cases, those have kind of stayed in dark quarters of the company. So in other words, we try to tune customer lifetime value, but maybe we should do more of like showing customer lifetime value to the executives to say, hey, look, you should be taking this into account as you set your corporate priorities. It shouldn't just be a metric that I'm using, a knob that I'm turning to try to adjust our recommender model. It should be something that you see and you can make a decision like, hey, I want to invest in long-term customer lifetime value using data, improve the customer experience so that customer lifetime value goes up.
Yeah, I think that nice. A retention of your customers is another metric. And again, depending on your organization, if it's a high customer or a high volume of customers, that retention is really a big thing, or is it a low volume it's something that is more managed on a personal level? I think the other thing that is a concept we've talked about and we'll be working into the book as well is, I refer to it as a KPI of KPIs in the past. And everyone has all of these dashboards, metrics that are being captured. But unless you actually know the heritage of them, how the quality of them, how they're actually being used, and this is the key thing, how they're actually being used for decisions within an organization. And I did a bit of a test internally in our own organization to try and work out all the internal meetings we had. When we were growing, we had lots of historical meetings, do I need to be in all these meetings? What was the purpose of each of these meetings? What was the metrics needed in that meeting for me to make a decision? It didn't all work perfectly, but it was taking that concept and putting it into practice. But I think any large organization should really start with the shareholder statement, the company vision, what's been set as the company objectives at the beginning of the year. And then say, okay, well, for each of my layers of management I've got, what information is going to provide them the pulse or the lead or lag indicators for them to know they're going the right direction. And what that may be, it could be peer analysis if you're in a organization that has equivalents in other areas. Is John doing better than Paul? Or in different departments, different areas that have the same sort of size geographic area. What's the reasons for that? So having the data that allow them to ask the questions that they think they need to know, but also they answer the questions that happen afterwards. Each company or each meeting you have, you should be what's going to, if I'm having a meeting, I should have a decision at the end of it. Having a decision, what's going to enable me to make that decision? What data is going to be available and when is it available? Maybe I should have my meeting on that date because the data is not available till the day before. So let's actually change the cadence to meet when the day, or maybe I can say, actually I need that data earlier because if I don't get that decision made that day, it has an impact on a decision. We had a concept within a post as well, but it was talking about data has an erosion time, and having data really, really frequently could not give you any competitive advantage, but not having it in time could be another one. So, as a use case for when to go real time. If I wanted to know exactly my stock forecast and sales forecast and trend analysis, my data scientists, as if this clothing is, still on the up of people wanting it, to go and get a volume discount from a supplier that the date had to get the order in by that particular date, the data for that forecasting is worth more to me before I need to put that booking than after. So then it makes sense for any of the data feeds that needed to support that decision to go real time. For example, if my accounts payable is only chasing, the bad debtors up, or, the over 90 days one at the end of the month or the last few days of the quarter or something, I only need to have that one updated on a batch at maximum, maybe not even every day, but, probably, to keep it up frequently every day, it's probably the best, but it definitely doesn't need to be real time. So, understanding the value that data can provide sooner, if it provides additional value for that, then that helps drive your technical strategy. So, all links back, as you start at the beginning, Solomon, is, how do you make these decisions? So then you're making decisions. All right, I'll make it on this. When's the data available? It all becomes from that. You can get business process. So even those meetings are part of business processes, because your company, if you're having those meetings, that meeting is something you haven't automated yet. And maybe you can automate some of those meetings, and meetings cost a lot. We can do more podcasts instead. That's more valuable.
There you go. Much more valuable. So then who is in charge then of that data monetization or the business impact? Is it the business leaders that are in charge of channeling the data team through their functions, or is it the data team that should be responsible for driving that business impact in the organization?
I think it's a combination. And so one of the concepts where Chris and I have evolved is we started just with data monetization with like very direct value tied to data. And then we realized that companies can have a lot of different priorities, right? So if I'm Amazon, say a decade ago, I've IPO'd, but I'm very concerned with growth. Like that's one of my primary focuses is growth, customer acquisition, like becoming bigger so that I can make more profits in the future. And Amazon lost money for a long, long time. And so clearly they were not concerned about profitability. They were concerned about this metric of growth. And that was the concern of their investors as well. And so I think business performance comes down to whatever the CEO decides is important. It might be customer acquisition, it might be growth, it might be profitability, it might be margins, but it's ultimately the leader's job to set those priorities. And then it's the job of data teams to take those priorities and try to execute on them. So if I'm really concerned with growth, customer acquisition, and reducing churn, then I'm trying to use data to do those things that the CEO has set for me as priorities. If margins are extremely important, like say manufacturing margins, then I want to use data to reduce waste in my supply chain and so on. And so I think it's always coming down to both. Another thing I'll say is that back to what you were saying earlier, Solomon, about decision making, there's this feedback loop where data teams need to help the CEO and other executives set those priorities, bring the data to the executives and say, we think the data tells us this. Maybe it's time to adjust our priorities based on what we're seeing in the numbers.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think just to add to that, just to add to that, I think it's everybody, is it? But everyone has a role in as part of it. And I'll give two scenarios. I'm going to give that perfect world, that perfect company that everything works in the right order, and then it should be the CEO. Right, this is the vision I've got. Right, how can each of my C-suite advisors help me achieve that, with data being part of the core part of that? And then he should provide someone that strategic goal, that goal to define that strategy of what that is, collectively working them, build that case up. And then go for that one-off. Here you go. This is how we're doing it. We're going to keep coming back and meeting and refining it and checking we're going in the right direction. And unfortunately, that scenario is probably not very frequent. That everyone has that initiative in that correct order. I think if you can, then I think a combination of the data practitioners in an organization helping to do that storytelling, helping to define what the art of the possible is. And I think a lot of the CEOs don't know what can be done. And I think if you can start creating that, I'm doing a podcast with the one the show with Scott Taylor, and it's all about selling your data project. And I think the data team yourself you should be seen as a sales and marketing capability or department yourself and selling your successes. And getting the CEO to listen, because if he doesn't want to hear now, he's going to listen when he starts hearing the CMO hear about this great piece of work and why he's able to deliver something that hadn't been done previously, or the CFO is now being able to provide the end of year accounts day 6 rather than day 14 before. How am I able to get it earlier? Oh, I got this bit real time. That was the last piece of the puzzle. I refer to it as poles in a tent. The tent doesn't become a pole until the last. That's right. The tent doesn't become a tent till the last pole's in there. So you want to get the tent up quicker. You want to be able to get that thing that's stopping you putting things in, or that longest pole in there. So yeah, it's everybody that needs to be, but it's starting with the data storytelling and a playbook, maybe a book that will help people, guide them through this will be useful.
Yes. Books are definitely always helpful with this kind of stuff, right? It's interesting because my strong belief in what I've said many times is that data is like a sidekick to the business, right? It's a support function, and so given that framing, what you just discussed around how do you need to sell yourself as a data team? How do you need to sell the support that you're bringing? Kind of does play into that. So in terms then of like what on the where companies go wrong with monetizing their data or expecting data to drive an impact, what are some of the political challenges that oftentimes you see happening inside companies that are holding data people back from being able to sell those projects effectively or being able to succeed? I mean, we all know that average tenure of a CDO is not particularly great, right? So what are some of the things there that are causing issues?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think we see a lot of the same stuff in data politics that we see in the other parts of the company. So you can get into turf wars. You can have people claim that your numbers are invalid and therefore you shouldn't get money, or that your division should get cut down. You have people trying to grab different parts of data. So, for example, one organization, a vertical within the company might claim that they should own a certain data process and fully internalize it rather than letting it be done by a data team. And going back to the CEO question, I mean, I think that CEOs do have a responsibility to try to create a better political culture within their companies, but sometimes it's a tough order. Like, I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Solomon. Do these themes resonate? What have you seen? Have you seen similar things? Have you seen different things?
I've seen everything
Okay.
in over the years. I mean, I started off my career being less of a sidekick and more of a driver for the specific, whatever initiative it was. If it was touching marketing, it was for a marketing thing. If it was touching operations, it was for an operations thing. And then over time, what I learned is that ultimately it should probably be the executives and it shouldn't be me that is making the final decisions around what rolls up to them. Because if you're a CRO, you're going to get fired if you don't hit the number. I have ideas for how I can help you hit the number. And I as much as you want the company to succeed. But if you are the person that is in charge of the coordinated strategy inside the company to hit a revenue number because you're the chief revenue officer, then ultimately that should be your call. And I was here to support you, and we're probably going to agree 9 out of 10 times. But if that one time we disagree means that you couldn't execute your strategy, then that was probably not the right thing to do. That's kind of the realization that I came to over the years.
Yeah, I think the thing that we highlighted both. I was going to go technology bit with the first one. I'll come back to them, but I think it's the C-suites that give different KPIs or metrics, or CEO gives different metrics to each of them that conflict with each other. And the larger the organization, the more this happens with, you're incentivizing each of these departments to achieve certain things, but if one does well here, it actually means that another one can't do as well. So I think that becomes down to a strong CEO or a good leader that can actually understand the vision of what's there. And I also think there's a C-suite themselves that can be bought into a roadmap. I think this is where the data team can help facilitate that, because if you're able to hear to each of these stakeholders, have each of these different problems, and you're able to take the different projects they've got as different vehicles and run them in an order that they all complement each other, or they're actually the good old days of architecture, looking at the jigsaw puzzles, knowing what's going to join up well, and having that ability to make those roadmap decisions. And that's where it falls down to the technology piece, because with organizations where there's an emotional attachment on certain technologies that people are fearful of their jobs if they move from one technology to another, because that's what they've always known, so they're resistant and won't help with any transformation activities. They're the things that normally cause things to fail. I think where we're going to see the more successes, I think it's that in organizations of a certain size that there's one or two individuals that can actually say, well, and have got that data savviness and actually know how to do this. Like, this is how we're going to do it. This is the technology we're going to do. I don't care if it's Databricks or Snowflake. We're going to go with one of them. We'll have a bit of an assessment of which one's the best for our use case, and that's it. We're going with it. And having a strong leader that's setting those boundaries of what's centralized, what's decentralized. This is the direction we're going. This is how we're going to recheck every now and then and validate that we're going in the right direction. That they're going to be the successes. I think we're going to see an era of the challenger era. We've heard of challenger banks, these new digital banks that are challenging them. I think the industry is going to be turned on its head again now with this. With the ability that data is providing to us now with generative AI and other automation activities out there, is if I didn't have all of that friction internally, could I create a smaller, leaner company that is more aligned, that can go and disrupt the world? And I think that's what Bezos did really with Amazon. He had a vision of what he wanted to do. He gave them boundaries of what each of the things could do. And later on, when he pieced the puzzles together, we all seen what he built. And I think that's the approach that companies should be starting to look at now.
That's really interesting. I really think that what you said about the competing metrics and how the CEO figures out how to work with the C-suite in order to pull that together and the data team's role there is really important. I'll give a personal example. We had marketing goals for the marketing team that said we want X many new customers, and the best customers or the least developed markets for the company were internationally, where also average customer value was lower. And it just happened to be that the product team had the goal of increasing average customer value, right? And so you have these situations that happen all the time where people working to improve the company kind of step on each other's metrics. And if you don't have a good leader at the senior level who's able to coordinate, because if you have reasonable people at the executive leadership team that all get into a room and see this dynamic happening, they can adjust numbers, or they can decide, is this something we want to do? How do we want to proceed here? Right. And the challenge is, if you don't have that conversation and you get to the end of the quarter and people start looking at each other's numbers, and suddenly you're in a trickier spot. Thinking about it at that sort of C level, obviously, if you're the CEO of a big company, you already have a data team. You have things about it that you like or that you don't like, right? What kind of advice would you give to a CEO right now for how they should be thinking about their team through the lens of business impact or data monetization? And what are some of the things that they should be thinking about as they're sort of trying to evaluate their team's performance?
So I would say one thing is to make sure that that people are communicating up to you. So to what you were saying about these competing metrics, that often happens when communication is flowing down, but not up. And that means all the way through the chain of command. So you need technical people to be communicating up to team leads, to be communicating up to VPs and so on, so that the CEO has a pretty good idea of what's going on within the company. And that includes realizing what possibilities there are that have not yet been realized. If you're the CEO of a big technical company, there's no way that you can understand everything that's happening within those technology teams. It's hard enough for a person on the team. It's just way too complicated. But there are people all over that company that know about possibilities and ways that things could be better. If you have communication that flows up, then that will flow up through those management chains to the CEO. And if the CEO is willing to listen, that's where they can see a lot of opportunities. Then on the other hand, in terms of evaluating performance, it's the CEO's job to take that information, maybe data is not the right term here, maybe it's more like information, and make decisions and then pass the priorities back down about what the company is actually going to be focused on and how to deal with competing metrics, for example. And so if the upward communication says, hey, we have this tension between average customer value and customer acquisition, what do you want us to do? The CEO needs to make a decision and really clarify that. One thing I've seen in some organizations I've been inside is that if you have a CEO that's not listening and that's kind of checked out, it creates a terribly pathological company where you have it really turns into a Game of Thrones, right? Like people just trying to basically stab each other in the back, and that goes with data and every other part of the business, basically. So you do need
that has far-reaching consequences way outside of just the data.
I think the bit I'd add to that is that I think the CEO needs to do an audit of, and it's a very easy thing to say, that there's audit of the KPIs that are actually being used to drive decisions. I like the audit of understanding and maybe giving this task, passing it all back down of finding out who they're all dependent on for these metrics and making that decision. That gives you the ability to find out if you've got different sources of information which might highlight differences that you're seeing. But I think the next thing is still do probably an assessment, or I probably would say this because we built these, but a maturity of different capabilities in your organization. How mature is your data ops? How mature is your data security? How mature is your innovation capabilities? And a light touch view of it from my internal team. Normally, probably get an independent view, but having that as something that you can then use to work out what your next steps are. I'll go. Buying a house, you go and have it surveyed. If you've come in as a new CEO for it, you get your house survey, to make sure that there's no rot or it applies to all of the latest compliance or regulations. So I think that's really critical if you're inheriting something, you're coming in. If maybe you've been there a while and just haven't had a data focus, maybe it's a good time to start looking, how are we actually doing stuff? What we're doing with our data capabilities. It's start
interesting.
Small, work big, I think.
I've played a little bit of that type of role before. And what's interesting to me is that more often than not, actually what I'm reporting back is that the people are really good, not that the people are really bad, which is interesting. I think that the problem is on both sides, because when you might not have as much experience with what a good data leader looks like, you can't tell what good looks like, period. Yeah. And so it's just a question mark, and having someone come in and tell you what good looks like is tough. What I've also found is that you really have to have the right person do that, because it is a very tricky position of power to have. And many of the people who do that sometimes have conflicts of interest around the kind of work that they want to do afterwards. And that's been like, I've had that kind of stuff done to me. Like, I have done that, and I've had that done to me. And it is a tricky, it is tricky to find the right people to do that kind of stuff.
Agreed.
So what is your advice then outside of the C-suite going down to the data person level? You're working as a data analyst or data scientist or data engineer. What are some of the things that you individually can be doing to better drive impact inside your company?
I think it comes down to this idea of communicating up. So what I often find in companies is that there are two main types of people who understand the business extremely well. You have your domain experts. So in other words, this is the person who's not strictly speaking a data person, but they're responsible for some part of the business. They manage something, or maybe they handle analytics for one part of the business, and they can tell you all about that particular part of the business inside and out if you just go down and have a conversation with them. And then the other is the data people connected with them. So the data engineers collecting the data for that manager, and they start to know a lot about what's in that data and about the business process. And so if those two, the stakeholder, like the domain expert and the data person, can communicate and then communicate up possibilities in the business, that can make it a much healthier business. So for example, if I was, say, a Google Ads manager, I was responsible for click ads through Google search, and I was seeing certain types of ads were performing very, very poorly. It's just wasted money thrown down the drain. If I can somehow communicate that up with supporting data and say, hey, we should change our ad strategy here, that adds a lot of value. Now, ideally, the company has a culture where that person gets recognized for that work. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately. But from my perspective as the individual, that's what I want to be doing, is identifying opportunities and then communicating them upward.
I mean, it's to ask why you're doing something as well. So, and understanding how your data is being used and consumed, because go back to the art of the possible. Why they were doing something, they could have inherited that process. They've always done it historically. They're not actually sure how it's being used, and understanding how it's being consumed or the downstream processes. You can look for areas of, oh, by the way, I could give you even more than you thought. By the way, you have it at this granularity. By the way, I've got these other attributes that are available now. Would they be useful? So I think it comes back down to that selling, selling your capabilities, and especially in this world at the moment, go back to if you're working in an organization, you have a cost. You need to justify your cost. And I know that sometimes, you've got a job in your job spec, but, when cuts are being made, if you can't evidence the value and aren't evidence your role in a large organization, I like to think of it as a gearbox. Your data department is a highly tuned gearbox engine, and each person in it is a cog in there. And, understanding how you're actually working and what you're there, and, what your role is in that engine or that gearbox is critical. And you can work out how you can maybe optimize better, maybe work out where you need a bit of oil on the gearbox.
I love it. And, Matt, it's interesting because the piece that you said of communicating up, I've always felt is so important. And the interesting thing about data people is that you are seeing things that no one else is ever going to see in the raw data, is the reality of the job that you're doing inside your company. And so there's a whole category of insights and important information that you are the only person that can ever be the one to identify that and then bring that to the forefront. And it's interesting, if I think back to some of the things that I've done and like the impact that I've driven in companies, probably 25% of it is from the things that people told me to do, and I just did a good job executing on it. But realistically, anybody could have, if it was a query, that's a replaceable thing. Anybody can run a query. But where I've driven the most value is in the stuff that only I could have done because I noticed something and I said something, and then as a result, something changed. And I think that if you took that gearbox analogy, it's like too many data people are stuck in first gear where they're just waiting for a project to come in and someone to tell them what to do. Really, there's a couple gears higher there's really kind of no limit. If you find something interesting and important enough that can change the course of the business, you can go right to the CEO. And your insights can go right to the board of directors, and that could change the entire future of that company. And so that I think is I really like what you've said, and just want to triple down on it because it's exactly what I've seen as well. We're coming up on time. Thank you both so much for joining the podcast. Where can people follow your stuff and read your book when it comes out and see what you're doing?
Let's see. The best place for me and for Chris too, I think, is probably LinkedIn. So that's where I tend to post things. And then we'll have more announcements about the book upcoming, but we'll be releasing some excerpts, some supporting materials, some related blog posts on Substack. And so we'll announce exactly when those are coming out. If you follow on LinkedIn, and then you can get linked to Substack from there.
Yeah, and also the hashtag Mean Data Streets is a good one to follow for some entertainment on the data side. So, or you'll find us in the London. Well, find me in the London meetup or the New York meetup, because I've split with my time between the two. So Aaron's meetup, so it's a good one. Or if you're in London, come find us at our meetups. We've got next one 16th of August. So yeah, come along.
All right, great. Well, thank you both for joining, and thank you for listening to the Delivery Layer podcast.